I'm telling you this story because someone needs to know the truth. My name is Dr. Klaus Sullivan, and 3 months ago, I was part of a classified expedition that discovered something beneath the Siberian permafrost that should have stayed buried forever. The official reports will tell you it was a natural disaster. Earthquakes, tectonic shifts, standard geological phenomena. They're lying. It started with a phone call that pulled me away from a fishing trip in Montana. 24 hours later, I was strapped into a military helicopter, watching the endless white expanse of the Siberian tundra roll beneath us like a frozen ocean. The bite of October wind cut through every layer of Arctic gear as we descended toward a makeshift research station carved into the permafrost. Jesus Christ, Specialist Isa Kowale muttered from across the cabin, her breath forming clouds despite the heater running full blast. She was the only woman on our 4-person team, a Arctic operations specialist with hands steadier than a surgeon's and eyes that missed nothing. How long is that thing? I pressed my face against the frost-covered window and felt my stomach drop. Below us, cutting across the pristine white like a surgical incision, was a jagged black fissure that stretched beyond the horizon. 3 miles of visible length, maybe more, with edges so clean they looked deliberate. Steam rose from its depths, impossible wisps of vapor that had no business existing in terrain where the ground stayed frozen solid year-round. Preliminary measurements put it at over 4 miles long, Dr. Todd Clark shouted over the engine noise. The permafrost specialist consulted his ruggedized tablet with gloved fingers that never stopped moving, a nervous habit I'd noticed during our briefing. Here's the strange part. It appeared overnight. Satellite imagery from 2 days ago shows solid permafrost. Then we get those 5.8 and 6.1 earthquakes. And boom. This. 20 years of geological fieldwork had taught me to trust my instincts, and every instinct I had was screaming that this was wrong. I'd mapped underground tunnel systems in Afghanistan, studied volcanic formations in Iceland, and investigated seismic activity across 3 continents. Nothing in my experience explained what I was seeing. The helicopter touched down with a jarring impact that sent vibrations through my spine, tremors that felt disturbingly familiar to explosions I'd felt during my Army Corps days. But this wasn't ordnance. This was the Earth itself, shuddering like something wounded. Colonel Brian Lotus waited for us at the landing zone, his compact frame bundled in Arctic gear, but still projecting the kind of authority that made even veteran scientists stand straighter. His face was grim beneath protective goggles as he approached through the swirling snow. "Dr. Sullivan, glad you made it," he said, extending a hand with a grip that spoke of years commanding men in hostile environments. "I know the Pentagon pulled you off vacation for this, but once you see what we're dealing with, you'll understand why we needed someone with your specific background." I shouldered my equipment pack, feeling the familiar weight of geological survey tools mixed with emergency gear. Something about this assignment felt different from the moment I'd received the classified briefing. Not just another consultation, but something that could change everything we thought we knew about the world beneath our feet. "Colonel, with respect, I've seen plenty of seismic activity in my career," I said, following him across the frozen ground toward the dark gash, maybe 200 yards away. "What makes this so special that you needed someone who's mapped underground military installations?" Lotus gestured toward the fissure, and I felt the wrongness of it hit me like a physical blow. Because normal seismic activity doesn't do this to permafrost, and it sure as hell doesn't generate its own heat signature. As we walked closer, I could feel it, a wrongness that went deeper than visual anomalies. The permafrost here should have been solid as concrete, locked in place by thousands of years of sub-zero temperatures. Instead, the edges of the fissure showed signs of recent melting. Dark patches of exposed soil steamed slightly in the -20 air, creating an organic smell that reminded me uncomfortably of decomposition. "The earthquake started 3 weeks ago," Clark explained, pulling up seismic data that made my blood run cold. "Nothing unusual at first. We get tremors in this region regularly. But then they started clustering around this exact location, and they kept getting stronger." I studied the data over his shoulder, noting patterns that defied everything I knew about tectonic activity. Earthquakes didn't behave like this, clustering so tightly, escalating in frequency while maintaining consistent depth readings that seemed to suggest something was pushing upward from below. Cole crouched near the edge of the fissure, peering down into darkness that seemed to swallow her flashlight beam. "I can feel warm air coming up from down there," she called back to us. "How is that possible?" I joined her at the edge, kneeling carefully on ground that felt disturbingly unstable. The fissure dropped away into blackness, its walls showing layers of permafrost that had been split apart like pages in a book. But what caught my attention was the sound. A low, almost subsonic rumble that seemed to pulse with a rhythm that reminded me uncomfortably of breathing. "Have you done any depth measurements?" I asked Lotus. "That's why you're here," he replied, his voice carrying an edge of frustration. "Our standard equipment is reading inconsistent depths. Sometimes it shows 300 feet, sometimes it shows no bottom at all. We need someone who understands geological formations to make sense of this." I unpacked my ground-penetrating radar unit, a piece of equipment I'd used to map underground installations in places the government preferred not to acknowledge. The device hummed to life, sending electromagnetic pulses deep into the earth and measuring the return signals with precision that had saved lives in hostile territory. The readings made absolutely no sense. "This can't be right," I muttered, adjusting the calibration and running the scan again. "According to this, there's a massive void space starting about 200 feet down, but the permafrost layer should extend at least 400 feet at this latitude." Clark leaned over my shoulder, his nervous energy radiating like heat. "What kind of void space?" I studied the display, watching it paint a picture of the subsurface that challenged everything I thought I knew about Arctic geology. The radar was showing a cavern system of impossible size, chambers that extended for miles beneath our feet, connected by passages that formed patterns too regular to be natural. "It's showing a cavern system," I said slowly, my military training warring with scientific curiosity. "Huge. Possibly natural, but..." I paused, studying return patterns that made my hands shake. "There's something else. The radar is picking up movement down there." "Movement?" Lotus's voice sharpened with the kind of alertness that came from years of expecting the worst-case scenario. "What kind of movement?" Before I could answer, the ground beneath our feet trembled. Not the sharp jolt of an earthquake, but a slow, undulating motion that seemed to rise from deep below like something vast stirring in its sleep. The warm air rising from the fissure suddenly carried a smell that made my throat close, something organic and ancient, like meat left too long in a cellar. Koale scrambled back from the edge, her face pale. "Did you guys feel that?" The trembling came again, stronger this time, and with it came a sound that made every primitive part of my brain scream warnings. It started as that same subsonic rumble, but gradually rose in pitch until it became something that sounded almost like communication, like something vast and hungry, calling from depths that shouldn't exist. My radar unit suddenly erupted with activity, the screen showing movement signatures throughout the underground void that made my blood freeze. Not the slow shift of geological formations, but rapid, coordinated motion. Dozens of large objects moving in patterns that suggested purpose, intelligence, and something worse: organization. The readings showed contacts roughly 7 to 9 feet in length, moving with purpose through chambers that extended far beyond our equipment's range. Whatever was down there, it wasn't alone, and it wasn't mindless. The readings showed hundreds of them. Hundreds of contacts frozen in the permafrost, but beginning to stir. "Colonel," I said quietly, my military training overriding the civilian scientists' need to understand. "I think we need to consider the possibility that this isn't a natural geological formation." Lotus was already reaching for his radio, his face grim with the expression of a man who'd been expecting bad news. "Base, this is Alpha Team. We need immediate backup at the site, and get me a direct line to Northcom." As if in response to his words, the fissure suddenly widened with a grinding crack that echoed across the tundra like breaking bones. The warm air turned into a steady updraft that carried more of that organic smell, and for just a moment, just long enough to haunt my nightmares forever, I saw something grotesque and inhuman moving in the darkness below. Something roughly 8 feet in length, with an extremely gaunt and elongated body that looked almost skeletal. Its grayish, sickly skin appeared stretched tight over bones, and it moved on 4 disproportional limbs, arms and legs that were unnaturally long and thin, ending in bony, spider-like appendages. Even from this distance, I could make out its hunched posture, like a predator ready to strike. But it was the head that made my stomach lurch, elongated and hairless, with deep, shadowy eye sockets that seemed to radiate hunger and malice. And the mouth. God, the mouth was open in what looked like a grimace of agony, filled with sharp, uneven teeth. The thing looked like a nightmarish fusion of deformed human and alien aberration. The radar screen went wild with contacts rising toward the surface, and I realized with growing horror that whatever had been sealed beneath the frozen ground for God knows how long was finally waking up. And it was hungry. The backup arrived within 6 hours, 3 helicopters carrying enough firepower to level a small village and enough scientific equipment to establish a temporary research station. But by then, the fissure had widened another 20 feet, and the sounds coming from below had grown more frequent, more organized. I hadn't slept since our first encounter. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that elongated head, those shadow-filled eye sockets staring up at me with an intelligence that made my skin crawl. Clark had taken to pacing the perimeter of our hastily erected camp, muttering calculations under his breath about permafrost degradation rates that didn't match anything in the scientific literature. "The temperature readings are impossible," he told me for the 10th time, shoving his tablet in my face. "It's nearly 40 degrees Fahrenheit down there. That's warm enough to melt permafrost that's been solid for thousands of years. But there's no geothermal activity in this region, no volcanic vents, nothing that explains a heat source." Cole had been quiet since the sighting, spending most of her time checking and rechecking our equipment with the kind of methodical precision that spoke of controlled fear. She was a professional, trained for Arctic operations in hostile territory, but nothing in her training had prepared her for creatures that shouldn't exist. Colonel Lotus emerged from his command tent as the sun began its brief Arctic winter appearance, his face carrying the weight of classified conversations with people whose names never appeared on organizational charts. He approached me with the purposeful stride of a man who'd made a decision he didn't like but couldn't avoid. "Dr. Sullivan, I need to ask something of you that goes against every safety protocol we have," he said, his voice low enough that the nearby soldiers couldn't overhear. "Northcom wants a direct assessment of what we're dealing with down there. Visual confirmation, biological samples if possible, and a clear understanding of the threat level." I felt my blood turn to ice water. "You're talking about going down into that fissure." "I'm talking about you leading a descent team into that fissure," he corrected. "You're the only one here with both the geological expertise to navigate an unstable cave system and the military experience to handle a potentially hostile environment." The rational part of my mind immediately began cataloging all the reasons this was suicide. The fissure was unstable, the depth unknown, and we had visual confirmation of creatures that displayed predatory behavior. But the soldier in me understood what Lotus wasn't saying. This might be humanity's only chance to understand what we were facing before it was too late. "What kind of support would I have?" I asked, already knowing I was going to agree. "Koale has volunteered for the descent. She's qualified for vertical cave rescue and has Arctic survival training. Clark insists on coming along for biological sampling, though I think he's lost his mind, and I'll be providing tactical oversight from the surface with a full comm relay." I looked toward the fissure, watching steam rise from its depths like breath from some massive, hidden lung. The radar readings from the previous day showed hundreds of contacts in the deeper chambers, most of them stationary but some moving with increasing frequency. Whatever was down there was waking up, and we needed to know what humanity was dealing with. "Give me 2 hours to prep the equipment," I said. "And I want climbing gear rated for at least 500 feet of descent." Those 2 hours passed like minutes. I assembled a gear loadout that balanced scientific instruments with survival equipment, knowing that once we went down, we might be entirely on our own. Ground-penetrating radar, core sampling tools, high-powered lighting systems, emergency oxygen, and enough rope to descend into whatever hell waited below. Clark had prepared biological sampling containers with obsessive attention to detail. "If we encounter deceased specimens, I need tissue samples, bone fragments, anything that might help us understand their physiology," he explained, his hands shaking slightly. "The biochemical analysis could tell us how long they've been frozen, what kind of environment they require to survive, maybe even how to kill them." Koale checked our rappelling equipment with methodical precision. The fissure walls look unstable, she observed, running her fingers along the rope that would be our lifeline. Ice formation on the upper sections, but it transitions to exposed rock about 50 feet down. Below that, we're flying blind. At exactly 1400 hours, we positioned ourselves at the widest section of the fissure. Lotus had established a command post with direct satellite communication to Northcom, complete with real-time monitoring of our vital signs and audio feeds. 3 Army Rangers with rifles provided overwatch, though I suspected their weapons would be about as effective against what waited below as throwing rocks. Final equipment check, I announced, running through the ritual that had kept me alive in hostile environments across 3 continents. Radio check. Copy, Alpha Descent Team, Lotus's voice crackled through our headsets. You have clear communication with topside. Emergency extraction protocol is in effect. If I give the word, you climb fast and don't look back. I clipped my rappelling device to the anchored rope and leaned back over the edge of the fissure. The darkness below seemed to reach up toward me, carrying that same organic smell that had haunted my dreams. Warm air rose from the depths, creating an updraft that felt like breath from something massive and alive. Beginning descent, I reported, and stepped backward into the void. The first 50 feet were exactly what Cole had predicted. Ice-covered rock that provided solid anchor points for our gear. The fissure walls showed clear signs of recent formation, with stress fractures and loose debris that spoke of violent geological forces. But as we descended deeper, the ice disappeared, replaced by exposed rock that felt unnaturally warm to the touch. Temperatures rising, Clark's voice crackled through the comm. It's actually comfortable down here. How is that possible at this depth? I checked my equipment readouts as we passed the 100-foot mark. The ambient temperature had risen to nearly 50 degrees Fahrenheit, warm enough that our breath no longer formed visible clouds. The rock walls showed signs of organic deposits, dark stains that looked disturbingly like dried blood mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Surface. Be advised we're seeing biological material on the fissure walls, I reported. Appears to be organic deposits of unknown origin. Copy that, Alpha Team. Continue descent and document everything. At 200 feet, the fissure opened into a vast chamber that defied the limitations of our headlamps. I could hear the sound of water dripping in the distance, and the organic smell had intensified to the point where it was almost overwhelming, but it was the silence that unnerved me most. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of something holding its breath. Jesus Christ, Koale whispered, her voice barely audible through the comm. Look at the size of this place. I followed her gaze and felt my stomach drop. Our lights illuminated the edges of a cavern that extended far beyond their reach, with a ceiling that disappeared into darkness above our heads. The walls were covered in what looked like fossilized remains, thousands of bones embedded in the rock face like decorations in some nightmare cathedral. But it was the floor of the cavern that made my hands shake on the rappelling rope. Scattered across the uneven surface were shapes that looked almost like cocoons, pale, translucent structures roughly 8 feet in length, each one containing a dark silhouette that seemed disturbingly familiar. Clark, I called softly. Are you seeing this? The permafrost specialist's voice was tight with scientific excitement and primal terror. Those are preservation chambers. Natural cryogenic suspension. Whatever's inside those structures has been frozen for thousands of years, maybe longer. As we continued our descent toward the cavern floor, I could make out more details of the cocoon-like structures. They were arranged in rows, hundreds of them stretching into the darkness beyond our lights. Each one contained what appeared to be a creature in perfect preservation. Elongated limbs folded against skeletal torsos, elongated heads tilted at angles that suggested either sleep or death. Surface. Be advised we have visual confirmation of multiple biological entities in some kind of preserved state, I reported, trying to keep my voice steady. Estimate several hundred individuals in what appears to be natural cryogenic preservation. Copy, Alpha Team. What's the condition of the entities? I touched down on the cavern floor and immediately felt the wrongness of the place seep into my bones. The ground beneath my feet felt organic, covered in a substance that was part ice, part organic matter, and part something else entirely. The preserved creatures lay in their translucent chambers like exhibits in a museum of horrors, their grotesque features clearly visible through the frozen material. The things were roughly 8 feet in length, with extremely gaunt and elongated bodies that looked almost skeletal. Their grayish, sickly skin appeared stretched tight over bones that were too long and sharp. They rested on 4 disproportional limbs, arms and legs that were unnaturally long and thin, ending in bony, spider-like appendages. But it was the heads that made my stomach lurch, elongated and completely hairless, with deep, shadowy eye sockets that even in apparent death seemed to radiate hunger and malice. The mouths were partially open in what looked like grimaces of agony, revealing rows of sharp, uneven teeth. "They appear to be dormant," I replied, though something in my gut told me that wasn't entirely accurate. "But the preservation is so complete they look like they could wake up at any moment." Clark landed beside me and immediately began taking readings with instruments that seemed inadequate for documenting something so far outside normal scientific parameters. "The biochemical signatures are incredible," he whispered, his scientific excitement overriding his fear. "These creatures have been in perfect stasis. The preservation is so complete that cellular structure appears to be intact." Koale touched down last, her military training evident in the way she immediately began scanning the cavern for threats. "There's something moving deeper in," she reported, her voice tight with controlled fear. "Thermal readings show heat signatures about 200 meters to the northwest." I followed her gaze into the darkness beyond our lights and felt my blood freeze. In the distance, barely visible at the edge of our illumination, several of the preservation chambers appeared to be cracking. Dark liquid seeped from hairline fractures in the translucent material, and the creatures inside were beginning to stir. "Surface, we have a problem," I reported, my military training overriding the scientist's curiosity. Some of the preserved entities appear to be awakening. As if summoned by my words, a sound echoed through the cavern that made every primitive part of my brain scream warnings. It started as a low moan, almost subsonic, but gradually rose in pitch until it became something that sounded disturbingly like communication. Like something that had been sleeping for millennia was finally waking up and calling to its companions. And from the darkness beyond our lights, answering calls began to echo back from dozens of different directions. The sound was coordinated, purposeful, not the random vocalizations of animals, but something that suggested intelligence and organization that had been waiting in the frozen darkness for far too long. "We need to get out of here," Cole said, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Now." But as we turned toward our repelling lines, the sounds from the darkness grew louder, more urgent. And in the pale glow of our lights, I could see movement throughout the vast chamber. Dozens of preservation chambers beginning to crack and split, releasing creatures that had been waiting in perfect stasis for their chance to hunt again. The ascent from that nightmare chamber should have taken 15 minutes. It took 43, and by the time we reached the surface, the world had already begun to change in ways that would haunt me for the rest of my life. The creatures didn't pursue us immediately. That was what made it so terrifying. They were smart enough to let us go, smart enough to wait. As we climbed that rope with desperate urgency, I could hear them below, communicating in those subsonic frequencies that seemed to vibrate through the rock itself. They weren't just waking up randomly, they were coordinating. "Surface, this is Alpha Team requesting immediate extraction," I gasped into my radio as we reached the 100-foot mark. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely maintain my grip on the rope. Blood from rope burns seeped through my gloves, making every handhold slippery and uncertain. "We have confirmed hostile entities. Repeat, confirmed hostile entities awakening en masse." Lotus's voice crackled back immediately, tight with the kind of controlled panic that came from receiving the worst possible news. "Copy, Alpha Team. Extraction teams are standing by. What's your assessment of the threat level?" I looked down into the fissure, where pale shapes were beginning to emerge from the darkness below, climbing the walls with spider-like agility that defied everything I knew about anatomy and physics. Their elongated limbs moved with predatory grace, finding purchase on surfaces that should have been impossible to climb. The sight of them moving in coordinated groups made my stomach lurch with primal terror. "Colonel, we need to evacuate this entire region, now. And then we need to call Stratcom and tell them to prep every nuclear asset they have." The silence on the radio told me that Lotus understood exactly what I was saying. This wasn't a containment situation anymore. This was a potential extinction event. By the time we reached the surface, the fissure had widened another 10 feet, and the sounds coming from below had changed from communication to something that sounded disturbingly like hunting calls. The first creature emerged as Cole's boots hit solid ground, a grotesque, elongated nightmare that moved with predatory grace despite having been frozen for millennia. "Jesus Christ," Staff Sergeant Mike Hart whispered, raising his rifle with hands that shook despite years of combat training in Afghanistan and Iraq. "What the hell is that thing?" The creature paused at the edge of the fissure, those shadow-filled eye sockets scanning our camp with an intelligence that made my blood freeze. It was exactly as horrifying as it had appeared in Preservation. 8 feet of gaunt, skeletal horror covered in grayish skin that seemed to absorb light. But seeing it move, seeing it hunt, was infinitely worse than observing it in stasis. Its spider-like appendages tested the frozen ground with deliberate precision, and when it opened that horrible mouth, rows of sharp, uneven teeth gleamed in our artificial lighting. "Fall back to the helicopters," Lotus ordered, his military training overriding the primal terror that was written across his face. "All personnel, immediate evacuation. Leave everything except essential gear." The creature didn't attack immediately. Instead, it tilted its elongated head and made a sound that was part scream, part howl, and part something else entirely. A call that echoed across the tundra and was answered by dozens of similar voices rising from the depths of the fissure. The sound made every primitive part of my brain scream warnings about predators and death. That's when I realized the true scope of what we were dealing with. This wasn't just one creature, or even dozens. As more of them emerged from the fissure, climbing with spider-like agility that should have been impossible for something their size, I could see that we were witnessing the awakening of an entire colony. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all perfectly preserved and apparently unchanged by millennia of hibernation. Hart was the first to open fire. His M4 carbine barked 3 rapid shots at the nearest creature, the muzzle flashes illuminating the nightmare landscape in stark relief. The bullets struck center mass, but instead of dropping the thing, they seemed to barely slow it down. Dark fluid leaked from the wounds, but the creature kept moving with predatory purpose. "Standard ammunition isn't effective," Hart shouted over the growing cacophony of creature calls. "These things are tougher than they look." The evacuation became a running retreat as more creatures poured from the fissure with increasing speed. They moved in coordinated groups, some spreading across the tundra, while others climbed directly toward our position with predatory intent that spoke of intelligence and purpose. These weren't mindless animals. They were hunters that had been waiting in the frozen darkness for their chance to feed again. "Alpha Team, get to the extraction point now," Lotus shouted over the growing noise. "We've got inbound assets 30 minutes out, but I don't think we have 30 minutes. That's when Clark stumbled. I heard him cry out behind me as we ran toward the helicopters, our scientific equipment abandoned in favor of speed and survival. When I turned, I saw him on the ground. His ankle twisted at an unnatural angle from catching his boot in a snowdrift that concealed uneven permafrost. But worse than his fall was what I saw approaching him. 3 of the creatures moving with coordinated precision, their elongated limbs carrying them across the tundra with horrifying speed. "Clark!" I shouted, already turning back despite every survival instinct screaming at me to keep running. Cola was faster. She reached him first, hauling him to his feet with strength that belied her compact frame. "Come on, Doc, we need to move!" But the creatures were too close. The lead one lunged with speed that seemed impossible for something so large, its spider-like appendages reaching for Clark with predatory hunger. Hart appeared beside us, his rifle chattering on full automatic, but even multiple hits only seemed to anger the thing rather than stop it. The creature's elongated head snapped forward like a striking snake, those rows of sharp teeth clamping down on Clark's shoulder with a wet, tearing sound that I'll hear in my nightmares for the rest of my life. His scream cut through the Arctic air like a knife, high and desperate and utterly human in a landscape that had become completely alien. "No!" Coley emptied her sidearm into the creature's head at point-blank range, the impact spattering dark fluid across the snow. The thing finally released Clark, but the damage was done. His shoulder was a mess of torn fabric and flesh, blood spreading across the white snow in patterns that looked like abstract art. Hart grabbed Clark under his good arm, while I took the other side, and we hauled him toward the extraction point as more creatures emerged from the fissure behind us. Clark was going into shock, his face pale and his eyes unfocused, but he was still breathing. Still alive. "Evac birds are 2 minutes out," Lotus reported over the radio, his voice tight with the knowledge that 2 minutes might as well be 2 hours with the creatures closing in around us. The first helicopter appeared over the horizon, like salvation itself, its rotors beating against the Arctic air with mechanical precision. But as it approached our position, more creatures poured from the widening fissure. Dozens of them moving with coordinated purpose across the tundra. "LZ is hot," the pilot reported over the radio. "I count multiple hostiles converging on your position." That's when the second creature reached us. It came from our left flank, moving with spider-like grace across terrain that should have slowed it down. Hart tried to bring his rifle around, but the thing was too fast, too close. Its elongated limbs wrapped around him like a nightmare embrace, and those terrible teeth found his throat before he could even scream. The sound of tearing flesh and breaking bone was audible even over the approaching helicopter rotors. Hart's blood sprayed across the snow in arterial spurts that painted the landscape red, and when the creature raised its elongated head, pieces of him were still caught between those sharp, uneven teeth. "Hart!" Cole screamed, raising her weapon, but it was too late. The creature's feeding frenzy lasted only seconds, but it was enough. When it finished, there wasn't enough left of Hart to recover. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of blown snow and rotor wash, its side door already open. Lotus and 2 Rangers provided covering fire as we hauled Clark toward the aircraft, their weapons chattering continuously at targets that seemed to absorb damage without slowing down. "Move! Move! Move!" the pilot shouted over the engine noise. "I've got multiple contacts closing from all directions." I threw Clark into the helicopter's cabin and dove in after him, Cole right behind me. Lotus and the surviving Rangers backed toward the aircraft, maintaining suppressive fire against creatures that moved with predatory intelligence across the battlefield. The last thing I saw before the helicopter lifted off was Hart's remains scattered across the blood-soaked snow, being investigated by creatures that moved with the methodical precision of scavengers examining their kill. The sight burned itself into my memory with photographic clarity, the ultimate proof that humanity was no longer at the top of the food chain. Clark died during the flight to the temporary field hospital. Blood loss, shock, and what the medics described as massive trauma inconsistent with any known predator. His last words were a whispered warning about the biochemical samples we'd left behind in our abandoned equipment. "They'll learn from us," he gasped, his eyes unfocused but still carrying the desperate urgency of a scientist who understood the implications. "They'll adapt." "Stratcom is requesting immediate confirmation of nuclear authorization," Lotus said into his radio 30 minutes after Clark's death, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Recommend immediate tactical nuclear deployment for containment purposes." I felt my stomach drop as the implications hit me. They were going to try to seal the fissure with a nuclear weapon. It was probably the only option that had any chance of success, but the risks were enormous. A nuclear detonation in this region could trigger seismic activity across the entire Pacific Rim. "Colonel, a nuclear strike in this location could cause massive seismic instability," I warned, my voice hoarse from shouting orders during the evacuation. "The geological stress patterns we observed suggest this region is already unstable. A nuclear detonation could trigger earthquakes across the entire Pacific Ring of Fire." Lotus's expression was grim as he looked back toward the thermal signature of the fissure, now visible even from our distance. "Doctor, if those things spread beyond this region, earthquakes will be the least of our problems." The authorization came through 20 minutes later. Stratcom had approved deployment of a tactical nuclear weapon with a yield designed to collapse the fissure and hopefully entomb whatever creatures remained below. The blast would be officially reported as a natural seismic event, another earthquake in a region already experiencing geological instability. "All civilian aircraft are being cleared from a 200-mile radius," Lotus reported. "Official cover story is emergency geological survey due to increasing seismic activity. The device will be delivered via submarine-launched ballistic missile in approximately 6 hours." I watched the landscape below us as we flew toward the extraction point, noting the thermal signature of the fissure that was now visible even from high altitude. The creatures had spread across several square miles of tundra, their movements suggesting they were adapting rapidly to their freedom. Some appeared to be testing the limits of their environment, while others had begun what looked disturbingly like organized hunting behavior. The nuclear strike came exactly on schedule. Even from our position 200 miles away, the flash was visible on the horizon. A brief artificial sun that turned night into day for several seconds. The electromagnetic pulse knocked out our radio communications temporarily, and the initial shockwave hit us like a physical blow that rattled our teeth and made the helicopter buck like a living thing fighting for control. But it was the secondary effects that truly terrified me. The seismic shock radiating outward from ground zero was unlike anything I'd experienced in 20 years of geological fieldwork. The Earth itself seemed to scream as massive tectonic forces were unleashed by the nuclear detonation, creating seismic waves that traveled at speeds that gave us no time to prepare for what came next. The resulting earthquake measured 8.0 on the Richter scale, exactly as I had predicted. But what I hadn't anticipated was the cascade effect. The seismic waves triggered secondary earthquakes along fault lines that hadn't been active for centuries, creating a chain reaction of geological instability that spread across the entire region like dominoes falling in slow motion. Surface stations are reporting secondary seismic activity across the entire Pacific Rim, Lotus reported, his voice tight with the knowledge that our solution had created an entirely new disaster. Magnitude 6.0 and above earthquakes being reported in Japan, Alaska, and the western United States, and we've got a massive tsunami radiating outward from the blast site. The tsunami was the worst part. The nuclear detonation had displaced millions of tons of seawater, creating waves that radiated outward from the blast site at speeds that gave coastal populations almost no warning. The initial wave height was estimated at over 40 feet, carrying enough kinetic energy to level entire coastal cities. Estimated time to landfall in Japan is 8 hours, Lotus continued. Wave height at impact is projected at 30 to 40 feet. Evacuation orders have been issued, but he didn't need to finish. 8 hours wasn't enough time to evacuate entire metropolitan areas. We had just saved the world from one catastrophe by creating another. The cover-up was immediate and comprehensive. Official reports described the event as a natural earthquake triggered by previously unknown geological instability in the region. The nuclear weapon was never mentioned, and our expedition was classified at levels that ensured it would never appear in any public record. Hart was listed as missing in action during a classified military exercise. His body never recovered. Clark was reported as a civilian contractor killed in a geological survey accident. But as we flew back to civilization, monitoring radio reports of the approaching tsunami and secondary earthquakes, I couldn't shake the feeling that our solution had been incomplete. The nuclear blast had collapsed the fissure and presumably killed or reburied most of the creatures, but some had been on the surface when the weapon detonated. Some might have survived. The first reports of the tsunami's landfall came 8 hours later. The waves struck the Japanese coast with devastating force, flooding coastal cities and causing billions of dollars in damage. The secondary earthquakes had triggered landslides in Alaska, building collapses in California, and infrastructure failures across the entire Pacific Rim. The official death toll would eventually reach over 40,000 people, but it was the follow-up reports that made my blood freeze. Coastal cleanup crews are reporting unusual debris, Cole said, monitoring news feeds on her laptop 3 days after the disaster. Her face was haggard with grief and exhaustion, the weight of what we'd witnessed etched into every line around her eyes. Organic material of unknown origin washing ashore along with the normal tsunami debris. I leaned over her shoulder and felt my stomach drop. The news footage showed Japanese emergency workers finding what looked like organic remains scattered among the tsunami debris. Fragments of pale, elongated limbs and partial torsos that bore an unmistakable resemblance to the creatures we'd encountered beneath the permafrost. Some pieces were clearly damaged by the nuclear blast, but others looked disturbingly intact. "They didn't all die," Cole whispered, her face pale as she studied the images. "Some of them got caught in the tsunami and carried out to sea." The reports continued to come in over the following days and weeks. Similar organic debris washing ashore along the entire Pacific coast, from Japan to California to Chile. Official explanations described it as previously unknown deep-sea life forms brought to the surface by the seismic activity, but I knew better. We had tried to bury the problem with nuclear fire, but instead, We had scattered it across the world's oceans. The creatures that had been contained beneath the Siberian permafrost for millennia were now dispersed across thousands of miles of coastline, their remains being studied by marine biologists who had no idea what they were actually examining. The seismic aftershocks continued for months. The Pacific Ring of Fire experienced increased volcanic activity, with eruptions in Indonesia, the Philippines, and along the western coast of South America. The earthquake we'd triggered had destabilized tectonic systems that had been stable for centuries, creating a cascade of geological disasters that scientists struggled to explain without revealing the truth. 3 months later, I sit in my office writing this account, monitoring news reports of increasingly frequent, unusual marine life discoveries along coastlines around the world. The official story holds: natural seismic activity, unprecedented tsunami, unfortunate but explainable collateral damage. Torres is buried in Arlington National Cemetery, his sacrifice honored by a country that will never know what he died fighting. But Kawali and I know the truth. We know that somewhere in the depths of the Pacific Ocean, or washed ashore on remote beaches, there might be creatures that survived both millennia of frozen hibernation and nuclear fire. Creatures that are now free to adapt to a world they were never meant to inhabit. The earthquakes in Siberia have stopped. The fissure is sealed. The threat appears to have been contained. But every time I see a news report about strange creatures washing ashore, about unusual marine phenomena, about wildlife behaving in ways that scientists can't explain, I remember those shadow-filled eye sockets staring up at me from the darkness below the permafrost. I remember the sound of Torres screaming as those terrible teeth found his throat. I remember Clark's final warning about adaptation, and I wonder if we really solved the problem, or if we just gave it a larger hunting ground.